So, today we're going to wrap up our look at the marine reptiles of the Mesozoic, and then move on to Mesozoic mammals. We're going to skip off on Mesozoic plants. I did briefly touch on the rise of flowers, angiosperms that is, in when I talked about dinosaur history, but we want to make sure that we can get on Friday to begin our look at the extinction at the end of the Cretaceous. So I ended last time talking about these guys, beginning to talk about them, the Ichthyosaurs, or so-called fish lizards, one of the first Mesozoic reptile groups discovered. So limbs transformed into paddles. For the more advanced forms, very tall dolphin or shark-like dorsal fins, and also half-moon-shaped caudal fins, tail fins, which don't preserve normally because they're soft tissue, but in certain environments they've been preserved. And many of them, although not all, had long beaks. And as I mentioned last time, primarily fish and squid eaters, but some ate larger items as well. Now, early Ichthyosaurs weren't quite as hydrodynamically shaped. They weren't these tuna-shaped or shark-shaped or dolphin-shaped animals yet. Not a surprise, after all, these are creatures that had an ancestry on land not terribly much before this. Ichthyosaurs appear quite early in the history of Mesozoic marine reptiles. They're one of the first groups out of this Uriapsid radiation to move away from shore and become much more open sea pelagic animals. And this shows you some of the more basal branches, relatively small-bodied animals. But during the Triassic, you got some quite large ones too. So you got little guys like the Totsusaurus here, giant ones like Symbospondylus, that's the one in yellow here, so comparable to an orca. And others like Shonisaurus and Chastosaurus, you see it in sort of the salmon color there, that were much, much larger. And were, in fact, at the time that they lived, the largest animals on the planet. So, at this point, the largest creatures in the world were sea creatures, which is not unusual to us. That's the condition of the world today. However, as we switch over from the Triassic into the Jurassic, as the sauropod radiation begins, the sauropods outstrip any of the marine reptiles in terms of size. So these, and additionally, the giant Triassic Ichthyosaurs don't survive over into the Jurassic, and it's these tuna-like ones that tend to be much more common in the Jurassic and early Cretaceous. And here's just a little look at the phylogeny of Ichthyosaurs. So we see this big, diverse radiation at the base of not particularly fishy-looking things. And notice the scale bars are getting smaller in many of these, to somewhat more eel-like forms, and then to very fishy-looking forms. And essentially all the Jurassic and Cretaceous ones are these tuna or dolphin-shaped forms. They survive into the late Cretaceous, so upper Cretaceous or late Cretaceous, but not very far. So they make it barely over the boundary. In the course of their history, Ichthyosaurs have their limbs transformed even more and more into paddles, and they do all sorts of weird things with it. Because these fingers are no longer functioning as fingers, natural selection starts to play with them. And notice, first of all, they start getting many more phalanges, many more finger bones than you would expect in the hand of a tetrapod, and they're forming sort of a pavement. And eventually, you've got things like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 fingers. Are they really fingers anymore? So, if only we had their genomes, there'd be some really cool things to look at in terms of their developmental biology. What clicked off or what switched in a new fashion to produce these really weird-looking fins. And just to show you that's not just drawings, here's an actual skeleton of one. All right. These Jurassic, as I mentioned, Jurassic and Cretaceous Ichthyosaurs are much, much, much more dolphin-like than the early forms. This guy's shown about life size, is shown here. Paddle-like fins. Fins are primarily not the main form of propulsion. It's that half-moon-shaped tail The fins are probably mostly for steering. And something else about these guys are their gigantic eyes. Just want to point that out there. And the scleral bones, the ring of bones that surround the eye in most vertebrates, other than mammals, are quite huge in ichthyosaurs, and probably reflecting the fact that many of them could dive quite deep. And they needed this sort of reinforcement on these great big eyes to keep them functioning at depth when the pressure is crushing in on them. It does show something that's very un-dolphin-like or un-whale-like about them. And that is, of course, whales, and including dolphins, which are just small whales, rely primarily on hearing in depth. In fact, in many of the echolocation in the toothed whales, these guys didn't have that. They probably weren't super great hearers. Instead, like most reptiles, they were vision-oriented. So they had great big eyes. And we'll see how proportionally huge their eyes are to other animals in a bit. But they weren't all at depth. Some of them were up there in the shallows. And in fact, given their body profiles, given that they match the body profiles of tuna, of the fastest sharks, of dolphins, they probably were comparable speeds, because, and also of billfish. All those modern swimmers swim about the same speed. These guys almost certainly did as well. So, showing the size of these eyes, here is a dolphin size, a little bit bigger than a harbor porpoise, but about the size of, say, a bottlenose dolphin, ichthyosaur, and there's a human and a horse and an elephant for scale, as animals for scale. Its eyes, bigger than the eyes of a blue whale, bigger than the eyes of an elephant, almost as big as the eyes of a giant squid, which are the largest eyes of any living animal. And there were even larger ichthyosaurs that had eyes bigger than the biggest living squids. And squids, much like reptiles, are visually oriented animals, and that's why they have to have these huge eyes. You need to catch every last photon when they're in the depths. There's not a lot of light down there, so they need to capture it. And the way you do that is you get more megapixels, and the way you get more megapixels is you increase your retina. So there's just that many more cells available to catch incoming light. And so, yeah, these advanced ichthyosaurs scale along the sort of same general trend as things like giant squid. Now, ichthyosaurs were the first group of marine reptiles that were discovered to have young retained inside the body. And there are a great number of specimens where we have them inside the body. They typically had multiple babies at once, multiple small babies, which is sort of a more typical thing for a lot of reptiles to have many young. Some more are selected. So here's a really good case where the skeleton of the young is in pretty good condition inside. And this allowed them to inhabit the water and never have to come out on land. In fact, much like a whale, if these guys were beached on land, they probably would die. Up there, you see one, either it died in the act of giving birth, and notice the baby's coming out tail first, which is the way that whales do that, and that's so that the young retains contact with the mom until the last moment, and then it can swim up and catch its breath. Its first actual breath from the air. If it was head first, then it might potentially drown on the way out. But given the fact that this is dead, it could be that it was near the time to give birth and died not during birth, but before birth, and the young got pushed out by the gases of decomposition. And the other babies in here are all jumbled up together because of the decay process. As I mentioned before, some of these ichthyosaurs actually probably swum down to quite deep depths. And here's an early one that's coming out head first when these creatures could probably still move on land somewhat. Early types of ichthyosaurs. Okay, so remember I mentioned ichthyosaurs are part of this larger group called Euryapsida. One of the other major branches of Euryapsida I mentioned was Sauropterygia, which is an extremely successful group. Early Sauropterygids, Triassic ones, still retained fingers and toes and pretty good limbs and could probably walk around on land. And in fact, as I said, up until recently, we thought these guys probably came on land to lay eggs, but no, we now know that these guys had young developed in the body, and that seems to be a Euryapsid trait as a whole. Some are little, Eustichosaurus there, a little guy, about as long as my forearm. Nothosaurus there, shown about life size, although it gets even bigger, so a larger creature, sort of a Sauropterygian sea lion, if you will. One interesting group of Triassic forms in the Sauropterygians are the placodonts. They have really rigid bodies and even more rigid skulls. The name means hard tooth, and they have really powerful teeth. I'll leave this here for a moment. Really powerful teeth for crushing mollusks, for crushing shellfish. They have stout teeth up front for ripping the shellfish off the seafloor, and their palates and their mandibles have these gigantic crushing teeth for smashing up shells. These guys were not out in the open seas. They lived near shore, and they were Triassic only. So here's the skull of Placodus, and notice it's so solidified, you can't even see the sutures between the bones anymore. It really solidified up. This isn't like an ankylosaur with osteoderms fused to it. It's the sutures of the bones in the skull fused together. And here's another one. Some of them actually look turtle-like. They evolved a carapace of bony plates of osteoderms, but it's not homologous to the turtle shell. And so here are two of the shellier ones shown on coming up on shore. And just a few of them. We're looking here at the palatal view, so the underview of the skull, and all these the black masses there, those are teeth. So the teeth solidifying underneath the skull. All right, but much more famous than their earlier Triassic cousins were the plesiosaurs, the most specialized group of Sauropterygians. Plesiosaurs, the name means near to the lizards. They were one of the first groups of marine reptiles discovered, along with mosasaurs and ichthyosaurs. These guys were definitely paddle swimmers. So here's a very primitive one, Pistosaurus. That Pistosaurus is not technically in Plesiosauria, but sort of a kissing cousin. And its forelimbs and hind limbs have become paddles. They first appear in the form of Pistosaurs in the latest Triassic, survived all the way to the end of the Cretaceous. And they had a wide variety of food: fish, squid, shelled mollusk, other marine reptiles, depending upon the actual form. Here's Plesiosaurus itself. Shown about life size, actually, as I projected there. And here's another one. Here's Crocodyliforms, also shown about life size, and the limbs transformed into paddles. They get extra finger bones, but they don't get extra fingers. So you can actually still count the fingers on these guys. And there's a wide variety of sizes and shapes. There's two major clades. There's a short-necked group with great big heads, the pliosauroids. And there is a long-necked, small-headed group, the plesiosauroids. But, just to point out, nature does what it wants. There are some plesiosauroids that converge in form on the pliosauroids. They get big heads and short necks. Basically, the big-headed ones are going after bigger prey and chasing after them. The longer-necked forms with small heads are probably going after small prey. A traditional thought is they might be going after schools of fish, but we have some trace fossils that show they were also raking the seafloor, digging up mollusks to swallow. So here's a typical plesiosauroid going after a shark. Here's one going after some mollusks on the seafloor. There's even some plesiosauroids that seem to have been something like a filter feeder. So they would go after probably crustaceans or small fish, and then close their mouth around them and strain them out with the way their teeth are arranged. Not quite like baleen, but sort of like proto-baleen. In contrast, the big pliosauroids were munching on other marine reptiles and very large fish and so forth, with huge conical teeth. Now, about 10 years ago, a discovery was made that really modified our ideas about plesiosaur reproduction. So, people had traditionally thought given how reinforced their bellies were and how big their flippers were, maybe plesiosaurs were hauling their bodies up on shore and laying eggs there, sort of the way sea turtles do. And that wasn't a crazy idea. And then, as these primitive Sauropterygians were found to have internal young, thought, okay, but these guys probably did too. And then this specimen was found, a polycotylid, which is an advanced form. This is one of these plesiosauroids that looks like a pliosauroid. And inside of it is a baby. One baby. One gigantic baby. Now, that's not what we see in ichthyosaurs. It's not what we see in sea snakes. It's not what we're going to see in mosasaurs, where you've got a lot of little young. And even these creatures that have a lot of little young probably popped out their babies and the babies fended for themselves. That's what sea snakes do, for instance, in the modern world. This is a single giant baby. And in nature, when you have a single giant baby, you have invested a lot of time and energy into it. You care for it for a very long period of time. Almost certainly they did too. So this is a group of plesiosaurs with almost certainly long-term, like maybe multiple-year extended parental care. We don't know, however, if this is restricted up there within, like, say, Polycotylidae, one particular branch, or plesiosauroids in general, or all plesiosaurs. We don't know that yet. We don't know the reproductive pattern of other plesiosaurs. So here's one big baby coming out. This is comparable to like a dolphin having a single big baby, or a whale having a single big baby. And just a look at the history of plesiosaurs. So they're early cousins down here in the Triassic, the oldest ones at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary. And these are the pliosauroids, and these are the plesiosauroids. And then they managed to make it, some of these guys make it all the way up to the end of the Cretaceous there. Okay, now mosasauroids. These guys were the very first group of fossil marine reptiles pretty much ever discovered. I talked about the original discovery of Mosasaurus in one of the early lectures. This was the skull that was found in a mine in Maastricht in Holland. They're a late Cretaceous group. These are honest-to-goodness lizards. I don't mean that they are lizard-like. I mean, they are lizards. I mean, they are more closely related to my bearded dragons at home than they are to a turtle or a tuatara or a crocodile or a bird or anything like that. They are lizards. They are squamates is the technical term. Their limbs are indeed transformed into flippers, but you could definitely recognize their fingers here. We now have evidence that they gave birth live in the water, like the other big pelagic marine reptiles. And depending upon the particular mosasaur, some were fish eaters, some were mollusk eaters, some ate other marine reptiles. Tylosaurus here, for instance, is a macro predator. It would tear apart other large vertebrates in the water. Some were fish, or some were eating small fish, some were eating hard mollusks and so forth. There's Mosasaurus itself being discovered. And a modern restoration of these guys. So they are indeed honest-to-goodness lizards. Depending on the phylogeny of lizards you use, there's a lot of contention about lizard phylogeny. They are close to varanids, that is, monitor lizards, or close to snakes, or close to both. Snakes themselves are a type of derived lizard. And early ones basically just look like a monitor lizard going into the water, because that's basically what they were. They were small, like Dilophosaurus here, found within sight of the stadium, the Cowboy Stadium in Dallas, Texas. But over the course of time, not tremendously amount of time, these guys are just a late Cretaceous group. They went from little bitty guys to giants. And so here's Clyodestes, sort of a mid-sized one, a little larger than life size. Sorry, a little smaller than life size is shown here. And you see a bunch of variety of forms. Mosasaurs were only around for a few tens of millions of years, not like ichthyosaurs, not like plesiosaurs, but they were global. Here's one munching on another mosasaur. Here are some mollusk eaters with really hard, crunching teeth. This is shown with a forked tongue And of all the creatures I have shown in this course so far, this is probably one of the few that probably had forked tongues, because that is a trait not broadly distributed among reptiles. It's in the lizard snake group. That said, there are plenty of them that don't have forked tongues, and that might not work so well in the water. But of anything we've seen so far, that would be the one. And here we see a big one like Tylosaurus as an apex predator going after a polycotyledonid plesiosaur, which is going after fish, which is going after a smaller fish. Many of them ate the ammonoids, sort of shellfish. I'll talk about more about them on Friday. We now know that some of the derived ones had tail fins. Maybe not as sophisticated as the tail fins of ichthyosaurs, but they had a dorsal component of it. And we have evidence that they, like ichthyosaurs, like plesiosaurs, and like modern sea snakes, gave birth live in the water. So this is an early mosasauroid, one that's not even a full-fledged true mosasaur in the water, in a pelagic form. It's already got young inside of its body, and there's evidence of them in derived mosasaurs as well. But like ichthyosaurs and unlike derived plesiosaurs, many babies at once. They probably did not have a lot of parental care. Now, in the last decade or so, a series of studies looking at isotopic data and bone growth rates and so forth suggest that plesiosaurs, that the advanced ichthyosaurs, and possibly even mosasaurs, in other words, the pelagic swimmers, were all endotherms. But that this arose independently in each of these groups. So primitive sauropterygians seem to be poikilotherms, or at most moderate, low-grade endotherms, or more likely cold-blooded. Primitive ichthyosaurs were. It's the tuna-shaped ones that were endothermic. And of course, the vast majority of lizards are not warm-blooded. So we have this group 3 independent radiations of warm-bloodedness among the marine reptiles. Now, remember that in the modern world, endothermic fish, warm-blooded fish, are typically the pelagic hunters. And yet their cousins are cold-blooded. So this seems to be a general pattern we see in the marine realm. So this is actually looking at the bone acquisition rate. And we've got sauropterygians. So plesiosaurs have higher rates, almost on the level of birds. Even in this case, even the early sauropterygians show rates comparable to mammals, and none of them show traits like cold-blooded reptiles. And so, just a reminder, modern, fast-moving, predatory fish in the open seas typically have some form of warm-bloodedness, and it looks like the plesiosaurs, the ichthyosaurs, and the mosasaurs independently evolved that. So before we leave the marine reptiles, just to mention a few other groups. The remaining groups, like mosasaurs, are members of surviving groups of reptiles. There are 2 different separate radiations of swimmers among the crocodile lineage. One group, the Thalattosuchians, evolved first. They show up in the Jurassic. They survive in the early Cretaceous and then disappear. These were the more pelagic forms, the more specialized forms. And then another group called the Dinosaurs. Don't confuse this with Dryosaurs. Dryosaurs are a type of ornithopod. Dinosaurs are a type of croc. These are much more closely related to living crocs. They show up in the late Cretaceous. These guys actually survive into the Cenozoic. They survived the Great Extinction event. And I think you can see in general, these guys have pretty good, well-developed limbs. These guys were much less modified for marine life, but nevertheless, they were in the open seas. Then there's Chelonoidea, a group you guys know, but probably by its common name, sea turtles. They first appear in the mid-Cretaceous. Same clade as the modern sea turtles, but some of the branches that appeared then have since gone extinct. For instance, this particular branch here that includes Archelon, which is shown smaller than life size. It was one of the largest turtles of all time. Has gone extinct, but it's part of a larger group. So here's an Archelon fending off its nest well, it's trying to lay its eggs and keeping the trudonts away from them. Now, we know a lot about the biology, of course, of sea turtles. We still have them today. They do haul their butts onto shore to lay their eggs and then never see their babies again. Presumably, the fossil ones did the same. Finally, Hesperornithine birds. These are the only marine dinosaurs in the Mesozoic. But I'm not going to go over them in any detail. You want to remind yourself about them, go back to the lecture on derived birds, and we'll talk about them there. But they're the only group of marine dinosaurs. Ichthyosaurs, not dinosaurs. Plesiosaurs, not dinosaurs. Mosasaurs, not dinosaurs. Hesperornithines, dinosaurs. And there's a restoration of one going after a fish. So, here we go, using the modern meme for plesiosaurs, aquatic dinosaurs. No, all the animals that you think are aquatic dinosaurs are not dinosaurs at all. No. Some dinosaurs were likely adapted to at least a semi-aquatic lifestyle, maybe. Penguins are aquatic dinosaurs, and they are. We have marine dinosaurs today. They're penguins. And we see over the course of time, marine reptiles, different groups shifting around in terms of their dominance. So both the pterosaurs I talked about last time and the marine dinosaurs I've talked about the last two lectures suffered great extinctions at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary that I'll talk about on Friday. But I do want to talk about another group of animals that showed up in the Mesozoic that had most of its history in the Mesozoic, but at least some survived to this day and are, of course, are us. And that's the mammals. So, Mammalia, that's not a traditional or folk term. You go to the indigenous languages around the world, they don't have a word for mammal. And if you were to go back to ancient Rome and said, I want to see some mammals, even using that word mammalia, which is in Latin, they would have no idea what you're talking about. It is a scientific term. I mean, many cultures have sort of a word for beast, but it's not always as all-encompassing. It typically wouldn't necessarily include humans, and it might include lizards, snakes, and turtles. The name itself means basically the ones with mammaries, or the ones with nipples, because the giving of milk is a trait that mammals have that other animals don't. Living diversity, you don't need all these details here, so don't slavishly copy down every single bullet point. That's not the key thing. Just the key that got about 6,000 species. However, when you take rodents and bats out of the equation, it's only about 2,200. It includes the largest animals of all time, the baleen whales. And they're found on every continent, granted in Antarctica just along the coastline, and every ocean. So what makes a mammal a mammal? Well, in the modern world, mammals have fur. Duh. We're all hairy to one degree or another. Even whales have fur. A little bit, but not much. They're little whiskers. Some of those fur are modified into whiskers. Technical term is vibrissae, but the same thing as whiskers. We even retain whiskers, but they don't necessarily have the same sensory function anymore. We call them mustaches. And also, mammals typically have that wet nose, the rhinarium, although our particular branch of the primates has gotten rid of that. I mean, it can get wet if you've got a cold, but it's not the same thing as a kitty nose. You know, the part of the snoot that you boop. Mammals are endotherm to one degree or another. In fact, Therian mammals, marsupials and placentals, have generally high levels of endothermy. We have the mammary glands, that's where our group gets its name. Consequently, we have suckling, that is, the babies suckle milk. But in order to do that, they need new muscles. So we have modified face muscles that allow us to, a lizard can't do that, a snake can't do that, a bird can't do that. And mammals have long-term parental care. We got big brains. The only other group of vertebrates with comparably large brains are modern birds. So tremendously huge brains. Here we look at the scale and by body weight of the brain weight versus body weight. Mammals are scoring way up in here. We have complex chewing. So our lower jaw goes back and forth, forward and backward, and that allows us to process food in all sorts of different ways. And indeed, we have very complex teeth. Now, we encountered differentiation of teeth way back in our ancestors, when we looked at the history of the branching between the synapsid line and the sauropsid line. And in the synapsids, we saw the therapsids. And they had incisors up front for nipping, canines behind that for biting, and cheek teeth behind that for grinding. And we retain that. Our cheek teeth we call premolars up front, molars behind. Here it is in lateral view. And those cheek teeth can be super complicated. In fact, if this was the 400 level class I teach, you'd have to learn these different styles of teeth and the names of the little bumps and crests, because they all have names. You don't have to do that. However, with all our complexity of teeth, we have something that's sort of weird as animals go. We only get two sets. We have deciduous dentition. We get baby teeth, they fall out. We get adult teeth, and that's it. If the adult teeth get knocked out, you don't get another set. Some mammals try to find ways to cheat that, but they cheat it. They can never override this. And that's in contrast to the vast majority of other mammals. There's a vast majority of other vertebrates, which keep on getting new teeth throughout their life. The teeth might not be anywhere near as complex, but an old tooth falls out, a new tooth is there to replace it again and again and again. That's normal. What we have is weird. It also is something you can find in the fossil record, because you can section a jaw and see if there's new teeth forming underneath. And here we see an example of baby teeth in a horse and the permanent teeth, the adult teeth down here. Speaking of the jaw, mammals are frickin' weird in that our lower jaw is just one bone. It's just the dentary. So remember when we saw the anatomy of other vertebrates like dinosaurs, you got a dentary, or here's a lizard, a dentary up front, and then a series of other bones behind. And the jaw joint was between the quadrate of the cranium and the articular of the mandible, of the lower jaw. Well, if all we have is the dentary, then we can't have that articulation. And our jaw joint is between the dentary and the bone, the squamosal, which is over here in a lizard. So mammalian history has rewritten how the jaw is articulated. But in fact, we still have those postdentary bones, or at least some of them. And what's happened is they've moved up into our ears. Our middle ear bones are homologous to the the postdentary bones of other animals. And in fact, the ancestral jaw joint, it's still in your head. It's between the bone called the incus and the malleus, which is the quadrate, and the articular. It's still there, but it's no longer doing a weight-supporting function. Or sorry, it's no longer doing a jaw-supporting function. It is doing one of its old functions, which is to hear. You probably have heard at some point they say that snakes hear with their jaw. And that's technically true, but so do you. Most vertebrates get sound generation from that connection between the quadrate and the articular. The thing is, in ground-dwelling things like snakes, with these multiple jaw bones, they're getting the vibrations from the ground, and it's transmitting into that joint, and it's going on to the sound capsule. In our case, our lower jaw has become just the dentary, but that sound-receiving structure is still there because it's important, and it's moved up into our ear. That's the only thing it does now. What's really awesome, you can watch this transformation both in the paleontological record and the embryological record. Because in all of us, when we were little embryos, those bones were in our lower jaw. They form in our lower jaw, they detach and move up into the cranium. And here we see it going on in a marsupial, a modern marsupial during development. We have diaphragm breathing. Talked about that a couple weeks ago. So we've got a sheet of muscle that contracts, and our lungs expand to fill that, and then it relaxes, it pushes the air out, and that gives us a way to oxygenate our lungs independent of the muscles of motion. So here we go like this. So we have tidal respiration. The air flows in, and then it flows out. It's not the one-way respiration that birds have. So, 3 major groups of mammals. Again, don't write down all these details. Just showing them here. Monotremes, super rare. They're the egg-laying mammals. But of course, egg-laying is primitive. That's not a derived trait. Marsupials. Marsupials have young that are born live. The idea is live as opposed to in an egg, not live as opposed to dead. But they're born at a very early stage. They get transferred into a pouch. And then our group, the far more successful group, the placentals, young are born live, and there's an extended period of time in the womb. Monotremes retain a lot of primitive features. They have a sprawling stance. They have very small external ears. And of course, the young hatch from external legs. But those are all primitive traits. Marsupials plus placentals form a group called Therian, or the beasts. It's the same word element that theropod comes from, the beast-footed ones. And we have a parasagittal stance, as this baby wombat proves. Our scapula, our shoulder blade, is actually mobile. That's a brand new trait. It gives us more stride with our forelimb. We have pinnae, external ears. We, of course, have placentas. That's how the young can grow within the womb before they're born. It's just, and placentals are called placentals because we retain the placentation for a long period of time. And we have full levels of endothermy. All the ones I talked about Monday of last week, some more than others. And so that's actually the motion of the scapula there going on. And egg versus placenta. So that's the relationship between us. Monotremes branched off first. Marsupials and placentals form the clade Theria within Mammalia. Now, all 3 groups have that mandible that's made only of the dentary, and the post-dentary bones are reduced and incorporated in the middle ear. But it turns out that's convergence. So if you had someone in this building, whoever taught you that, which they will, because biologists don't listen to paleontologists, and they're way out of date on this because we've known this for a couple decades, it's convergently evolved among living mammals. It evolves independently in monotremes and in therians, because we have extinct groups here and extinct groups here that still have a connection between those post-dentary bones and the lower jaw. But this is a course on dinosaurs, and so I want to talk about the age of mammals during the age of dinosaurs. Because, in fact, there were lots of mammals around during the dinosaur realm. They were typically tiny. You know, here's the sauropod saying he'll never amount to anything. Now, some of the traits that characterize mammals, or therians within mammals, are difficult to preserve. Hair, you need the same circumstances that preserve feathers. External ears, same sort of thing. Mammary glands and their precursor, sweat glands. I didn't mention that. We have sweat glands. Sweat glands are the evaporative cooling structure on our surface. Mammary glands are actually sort of modifications of those. Those obviously don't preserve very well. Parental care of the young, you need special preservation that might indicate that. And as we covered over the course of a week and a day, recognizing endothermy in the fossil record can be difficult, although not impossible. Some are more fossilizable. The transformation of the lower jaw, the origin of deciduous dentition, the origin of differentiated dentition, diaphragm breathing, where the diaphragm doesn't preserve, but that separation of the dorsals into thoracics and lumbars that I talked about before, the area in front of the diaphragm versus the area posterior to it. And, of course, you can recognize parasagittal stance if you've got the right fossils. So some are recognizable, some less so. And so I'm going to wrap this up, and I'm going to go sort of fast and furious, but to give you a sense of mammalian evolution during the age of dinosaurs. So we get creatures that are close to, but not quite, in the mammals. Creatures which are very derived therapsids that, depending on your definition of mammals, haven't quite crossed over. And these are Triassic forms for the most part, although some extend into the early Jurassic. Here's one that's sort of mammally looking as restored here. And we see throughout their history this reduction of the post-dentary bones, but I've talked about that ad nauseum. As I mentioned before, it occurs independently between monotremes over here and Therians. Talked about that already. Incidentally, one interesting aspect of mammals is that most living mammals are either nocturnal, that is, they live at night, or are cathemeral. Remember when I talked about dinosaur senses? Cathemeral is active during day and night. So cats, dogs, hoofed mammals are typically cathemeral. However, almost all non-primate mammals have pupils that show the size and shape of nocturnal animals. And this and other lines of evidence has suggested that mammals of the Mesozoic were actually primarily nocturnal animals. So we are sort of children of the night. And as I'll talk about after we cover the extinction, we talk about the recovery from the extinction, it looks like the evolution of diurnality and even cathemerality among mammals is a post-extinction phenomenon. Now, most Mesozoic mammals were tiny. So here we see a cladogram. These are non-mammals, relatives of mammals. Here's sort of like proto-mammals. Here's sort of the beginning of true Mammalia. And notice how much these are all the lower jaws, how tiny these guys are, relatively speaking, to their ancestors. So Mesozoic mammals were typically shrew-sized. So notice that's a dime. Sort of squirrel-sized to house cat-sized to wolverine or badger or beaver, whichever of those, you know how big they are, sized. But the vast majority were down here in the shrew to squirrel size. Now, to be fair, in the modern world of mammals, that's true too. The vast majority of mammals are bats and rodents, and most of those are small. Now, for a long time, people said all Mesozoic mammals were sort of tree shrew-looking creatures. And it is true, some of them were tree shrew-looking. Tree shrews, little animals, pointy noses, climb around in trees. But the same time that we in the dinosaur world were finding all these wonderful feathered dinosaur fossils in the lake deposits of China and other parts of the world, the mammal folks were finding well-preserved, complete mammals. And they showed there was a wide variety of diversity. There were tree shrew-looking ones, but there were swimmers and burrowers and gliders. Now, when we look at Mesozoic mammals, we find there's more than the three living groups. So the three living groups, the names shown here encompass the living groups plus their ancestors. So monotremes would go in here, marsupials would go in here, placentals would go in here. But look at all these other branches. By the way, Mammalia is technically defined as the as the concestors of marsupials, so monotremes, marsupials, placentals, and all of our descendants. So that's that node. But there are other earlier branches which show basically almost all the adaptations that modern mammals have. And so there's this other term, Mammaliformes, which sort of encompasses the larger, more inclusive thing. Now on this cladogram, these guys die out pretty early. These guys are common throughout the Mesozoic, and some of them actually extend into the early part of the Cenozoic. And this group here, Allotheres, actually survived pretty well into the Cenozoic. So there was higher diversity, if we're talking about major branches of mammals in the Mesozoic, than there is today, where we have those three groups. And if we look back in history, whether we look at, so that's the time since the Great Extinction. If we go back to the beginning of Mammalia proper, or even earlier to the beginning of Mammaliaformes, no matter how you count it, the majority of mammal history was in the shadow of the dinosaurs. So the age of mammals is a fraction. It's about, around half or so of the total history of mammals. So just to show some cases of fossil mammals, here's like the oldest trace of fur, or the basalmost trace of fur. In the Jurassic, mammals were actually getting pretty diverse. One thing mammals did pretty well is adapt to life in the trees. So it's not crazy to talk about mammals being up in the trees. That was a habitat that dinosaurs weren't particularly good at. The Eumaniraptorids being one group that was able to get in there, but even in there, they weren't quite as sophisticated in terms of ways of life as mammals got. I'll show you this figure already. There were swimming mammals. This is sort of a Jurassic beaver. It's not a beaver. It's not a rodent. It's not a placental. But it had a flat beaver-like tail. But its skull was something more like a seal or sea lion, so it was a fish eater. There were multiple independent origination of moles in the broad sense. Even in the modern world, different continents have different groups that have become moles. And the same thing throughout the Jurassic and the Cretaceous. Or you can take a particular branch of the tree of life and see how different types of that mammal group or mammalian group produce different forms. So, and within one group called the docodonts, you got burrowers, swimmers, tree climbers, gliders. Some Mesozoic mammals ate dinosaurs. Okay, baby dinosaurs. But we have inside the belly of this Wolverine-sized animal the remains of baby Psittacosaurs, that early ceratopsian. And so here's one going after some Coelurtosaurs. Same taxon here, Repenomamus. As I mentioned, there were gliders. So it's a couple different groups produced gliding forms, just as we saw throughout the history of modern mammals. There's a bunch of different gliders. Got 4 minutes. Now, in fact, there are teeth of an animal closely related to this one found in the Arundel Formation here in PG County. We only have the teeth, so we don't know if the Arundel conodon was a glider like its cousin or not, but it's a cool thing to think about. Some actually look fairly beaver-like, and again, this is not a rodent, and it's actually sort of a beaver-sized animal. And this is a close relative, that's part of a group that actually survived into the Cenozoic. Here's a model of one of the relatives of it that was built during the pandemic, so the artist photographed it in his studio, his kitchen. One particularly important group that I'm going to just mention here are the multituberculates. They're probably the most important group of mammals to survive the extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous, but that are not with us today. They were basically doing the rodent thing before the rodents were doing the rodent thing. That is, they had those ever-growing incisors, like rodents have, and there were 9. Multituberculate means multiple bumps and refers to the form of their cheek teeth. So, kind of cool-looking guys, multis. We call them multis for short. Here are the weird, complex multi-teeth. Relatively recently found was this form. It's from another group of extinct relatives of the Therians, and the describers noted its similarity to Scrat from the Ice Age movies. So they didn't call it Scrat, but they did highlight that in the press releases. And we even do have the origination of Therian mammals. In fact, way back at the boundary between the Middle and Late Jurassic. So creatures in the Therian line, remember Theria is marsupials plus placentals. They diverged by the beginning of the Late Jurassic. Many of the early ones were arboreal or scansorial, so tree climbers. And so it's fair to say the ancestral Therians were tree shrew-looking things. So that's the placental branch versus the marsupial branch. And so we have actually a fair number of metatheres, that's the marsupial group, in the Mesozoic. One curious thing is that in the Mesozoic, or in the Cretaceous, metatherians are most common in the northern continents and are unknown in the southern continents. And that's curious because in the modern world, most marsupials are in Australia, and the ones that aren't are mostly in South America. So there's a Cretaceous one versus some modern. And there's a North American one, sort of an ottery-looking form. And then our own group, the Eutherians, the placental group. First show up in the earliest late Jurassic. Lots of good fossils of them now. So these are modern placentals. Nothing that sophisticated around during the Mesozoic. So, dinosaurs lived in a world in which these little guys were around, but they actually weren't a threat to them per se. But when the hard days came, it was our ancestors that did better after the Great Extinction Event. And what that was and how it happened will be the focus of the next several set of lectures. So take care, manage to get through it.